and fall on these amazing, beautiful guys as you just release the spirit of confidence in them. In Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Bless you. So we're going to come now and listen to Neil. And I think this series on Mark has been amazing. I know many of you have been challenged by it. God has spoken to you through him, and that's just a brilliant. And so we're going to hand over to Neil as he continues this series in the book of Mark. Bless you, Neil. Thank you.
So Jesus is over the other side again. In fact, he's always over the other side. He's always with the people over there. He's always with that was where he's from. That's where he loves to hang out. That's the kingdom thing. That's the Jesus thing, to be with the people over there, to be with the people from the other side. And here on the other side, Veronica pushes through the crowd to touch Jesus. And as she does so, she knows that she's healed. She knows it at once, and she shrinks back into the crowd and tries to begin to work out how on earth she's going to tell all her friends and neighbours and her colleagues and her family and her husband what's happened, when suddenly the crowd stops and Jesus pulls her out the crowd. And so we get to hear about it. The gospel writers get to hear about it. The crowd get to hear about it. And they get to hear her whole story. This is one of my favourite healing miracles in the entire New Testament. Let's have a read. It says, Jesus had crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake. Verse 24 of chapter 5 of Mark's Gospel. A large crowd followed and pressed around him, and a woman was there who'd been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She'd suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was free from her suffering, and at once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned round in the crowd and asked, who touched my clothes? You see the people crowding against you, his disciples answered, and yet you can ask, who touched me? But Jesus kept looking around to see who'd done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. As I say, I love that story, and I love that we get to hear about it just because Jesus took the time to stop and turn around and find out who this woman was. And so here on the other side, Veronica gets healed. And as she slips back into the crowd, it's all rather embarrassing until Jesus says, who's touching me? And then she comes sobbing and trembling and half laughing and weeping. She falls down at Jesus' feet and tells him the whole story. And what a story it is. She hadn't stopped bleeding for 12 years. Some days were better than others. Maybe she'd gone a few days without any trouble, and then 12 years. She'd lived with dashed hopes. She'd gone to the doctors so many times, and that had always cost her money and had never provided relief. In fact, it had made the whole thing worse. And it meant, I guess, that she slowly withdrew, that she became less and less part of the society that she was meant to be part of. My guess is that she's now in her late 20s, and that her childhood friends, one by one, had dropped away. It's really hard to make friends in your teenage years if you have a problem like this. Her marriage must have been so difficult. They would have had to make a choice, a horrible choice, between breaking the law and inflicting pain, or just being abstinent, forsaking intimacy. Both were painful, and she was isolated, and it wasn't her fault. The law said she was unclean, she was unacceptable to God. Through no fault of her own, somehow she was excluded. And this bleeding affected her prospects. Veronica was in pain. She was excluded. She was isolated. She was lonely. She was fearful. It affected her financially. It affected her spiritually. No part of her life was untouched by this horrible scourge that she had. Her whole identity was caught up with it. It was all wrapped up in this affliction that she suffered. Physically, socially, emotionally, spiritually, she was affected by this dreadful bleeding. Social life was at a zero. Her mental health was shot. Spiritually, she was excluded, and physically, it hurt. And as she just had one thought as Jesus came to the other side. I'll just touch his robe. If only I just touch his robe, I will be healed. As a good Jewish teacher, Jesus would have had tassels on his robes, and as he swept past, sometimes they would just have an opportunity to grab hold of one of those tassels from his robe. And of course, for Veronica, it was a mission fraught with danger. She might be exposed. She shouldn't really be there. She should be at home. She should be isolated. She should be resting. She was unclean. And so it was, all her courage was needed for this. And so she steps out of her house. She sees the crowd. She pushes through the crowd. And she says, if I can just get to Jesus. I don't think I even need to look into his eyes. I'm not sure he even needs to notice me. All I need to do is touch him, reach out to him. I love this. I think it's amazing, isn't it? Peter's mother-in-law, a few chapters ago, Jesus had leant over her, reached out to her, held her by the hand, and lifted her up. At the end of chapter 1, Jesus had reached out to the leper. He'd said, I am willing, be clean. And he touched him. Probably the first human contact that this leper had had for many years. He touched him. He reached out to him. And very often, Jesus reaches out to us. But there's something in the compassion of Jesus that makes him reach out to people, that makes him reach out to the likes of you and I. And yet, in this story, Veronica is reaching out to Jesus. Sometimes we have an amazing experience, an experience of God where he's reaching out to us, where he's leaning towards us, where he's lifting us up, where he puts his hand on the place in our heart or the place in our body that's hurting and damaged and needs healing and restoration and redemption. But sometimes we have to reach out to him. Sometimes we have to push through the crowd. Sometimes we have to ignore the noise, and we have to get through to him. If only I touch the cloak, the tassels on his cloak, then I will be healed. And in that moment of connection, we know that something happens in us. We know that God does something remarkable in us. And of course, very often we shrink back into the crowd and hope no one else has noticed. But sometimes we give testimony, sometimes we get found out, sometimes we tell our story, and then everybody gets to hear it. And it brings joy to so many others. She pushed through the crowd. She touched Jesus. He knew power had gone out of her. She knew something had changed in her. And sometimes we do too, as we push through to Jesus. So after this embarrassing moment, Veronica's blurting out her story, and she's overcome with fear, with joy, with tears, she's kneeling at her feet, she's laughing, she's crying, she's looking up, she's bending down, she's trying to make sense of what's happened, but she's trying to be coherent. She's trying to make sense not only of just these few moments, but she's trying to make sense of her whole life. And we get to hear it. Rather than her shrinking back, we get to hear it. We get to hear this amazing story of this poor woman who suffered so much, and the power that moved from Jesus into her body. And 3 of the 4 gospel writers tell us this beautiful story, and we identify with it, because we too are from over there. We too are from the other side. We too have stuff going on in our minds and our bodies. We too have stuff going on socially. We too feel isolated and prejudiced against. We too feel in a place where we know we're not whole, and we're reaching out to Jesus. And we know that power transfers from him to us. And Jesus says 4 simple words to Veronica, and they are beautiful. These are wonderful. Daughter, daughter, daughter. That's powerful. That's powerful. Jesus' identity had already been begun to be understood. The demons had cried out that he's the Son of God. Heavens had opened and God had said, "This is my beloved Son." He talked about the kingdom. He told some stories of the kingdom, and people knew that he was a messenger from God. They knew that if he wasn't the Son of God, if they hadn't twigged that yet, they knew that this was a God man. This was a righteous person. This might be the Messiah. This was God's anointed one. This was one who'd come with a message from God. And now he says to her, daughter, daughter. This is the God-man speaking. This is God speaking. This is God speaking to the likes of you and I. Daughter, my daughter, son. That's the word right there for someone. You are a dearly loved daughter of the King of Kings. You're a dearly loved son, a son of God. He calls you loved. He calls you favoured one. He calls you part of his family. He calls you daughter. He calls you son. And in that, all the uncleanness is washed away. All that separation from God thing, that's gone. She's accepted. She's a daughter in Israel. She belongs. She's part of the community of faith. You're loved. God says, my daughter. He is for you, not against you. Doesn't call you unclean. You don't even need to wait a week for that ritual washing thing. You are clean, you are pure, you are my daughter. You're accepted. There's one word that would help her to know her inclusion, her acceptance before God, that she's not written off. If there's one word that would change her mental attitude and her self-identity, if there's one word that could change her destiny, it was that word, daughter. Daughter. There's a great verse, isn't there, in 1 John chapter 3, that we are the children of God. That's what we are. That's what we are. And so this is her identity as a loved daughter of the Most High God, the one who's treasured and valued. Daughter. What an impact to her mental health. What an impact to know that she's accepted, that she's loved, that she's accepted by God, that she's dearly loved, that she's included. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Those prayers that you prayed, Veronica, those tears that you shed, Veronica, they were all scooped up into heaven. God collected those tears in a bucket. He heard those prayers and savoured them. Your faith counted for something. Those dark nights when you didn't know what you were saying or praying, I heard those. Those cries in the dark, I heard that. Those prayers that you prayed when you thought that they were just hitting the ceiling and making no difference, I heard that. That shouting that you made in the morning when you weren't better, and you shouted at me to do so, I heard that. Your faith has healed you, Veronica. It felt like, to her, if only. To the crowd, it looked like desperation. To the doctors, it seemed like the last resort. But for God, it was faith. Healing faith. Effective faith. Trust that God was going to break through. Trust that God would do something. Trust that if only I touch Jesus, something will be different. I'll be healed. For Veronica, faith was never a denial of her situation, but a determination to push through. To push through the situation, push through the crowd, push through the noise and get to Jesus. For Veronica, faith in God never stopped her trying the best medical care available, even if it was painful and costly. For Veronica, faith never stopped the mourning of the lost years, the lost friendships, the lost marriage, the lost relationships, the lost health, the lost friends, the lost events, the lost days. For Veronica, faith meant reaching out to Jesus. Faith meant ignoring the crowd, ignoring the other voices, in a singular pursuit of Christ. And that saved her. Your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. That's the third word. I explained last week that Middle East peace is much bigger than absence of war. It's much bigger than an absence of a storm. Middle East peace means wholeness in every part of our being. Peace is well-being. For Veronica, peace means new friendships. For Veronica, it means a smile on her face and not a worry about her bleeding. It means not always being aware of the possibilities that tomorrow she'll wake up and something horrible will have happened. Peace means a loving, good, intimate marriage. Peace means not being uncomfortable again. Peace means not bleeding uncontrollably again. Peace means a social life. Peace means accepted in the village, favoured by uncles and cousins and friends. Peace means no more wasted expense. No more failed medical procedures. Peace means prosperity. Peace means no more fear, not even in a month's time when it's due again. Peace means no one has anything against you. Peace means wholeness. Go in peace. No one's criticising you. No one's calling you unclean. You're safe. Go in peace. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. Be freed from it all, the physical pain, the mental anguish, the hurt of exclusion. Be freed from your suffering. You've touched Jesus and now there's a transfer of power that God has given you. He's heard your heart cry. Your faith has been vindicated. Now be freed from your suffering. Now. And Veronica was. She was. I say Veronica because the early church gave her that name. That name isn't in the Bible. Many of you will have known that. That name's not in the Bible, but the early church gave her that name. And that name, Veronica, means two things. One thing it means is seeing victory. Seeing victory. What a great name. Because even after 12 years, even after being desolate and isolated after 12 years, she sees victory. This woman embodies the hopes of everyone who's reaching out to Jesus to see victory. Everyone who's been marginalised, everyone who's suffering, everyone who's somehow unacceptable, everyone who's over there. You're the Veronicas. You're the victory bringers. And the other thing it means is true image. Isn't that beautiful? We're all in the image of God, aren't we? But now Veronica was in her true image. The Veronica she was meant to be. She was carrying the image of God, a wholeness in her mind and in her body, a wholeness in her relationships and in her faith, a wholeness in her religious practice and spiritual disciplines. There was a wholeness about her. She was the true image of God. She was the Veronica-shaped image of God, just as you are called to be your shaped image of God, to display God, to reflect God, to be like God, to be the best version of you can be. And that version looks like Jesus. And she's now the true image. And that broken woman with all that pain, she's now the true image of God. Go in peace. Be the true image. In the name of Christ. Amen. Amen.
Jesus, we want to thank you so much that you always have time for us, Jesus. Thank you, Father God, that you